All right, people can hear. Are you hearing more on this side than this side? If you're having, I think the sound might be better over here if you're having a hard time over there. So you might want to switch over here or just listen carefully. All right, I'm not going to hold this. Can you hold that? All right, first of all, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in London.
Thank you.
We thank you so much for being with us and for your work and your impossible task of trying to bring some clarity and some perspective around one of the most infuriating subjects probably ever. And that is, and for anybody to try their hand at even trying to figure out where to begin and how to bring it together and hear different voices, and coming from a perspective of a Zionist who loves Israel, makes it really a task for all of us to that we engage in our thinking. So let me introduce myself. I'm Rabbi Boxman. I'm proud to be the congregation of Congregation Kol Tikva, and we are glad to have Jack and Alana, and we made these arrangements with you and others. We have at our congregation an ARTSA committee, which is responsible for promoting Israel programming in our congregation and looking at Israel critically as well as lovingly. And in fact, in another month, next month, we're having a man by the name of Rabbi Greengrass. I don't know if you know Rabbi, but he is a Israeli scholar and teacher, and he's going to be talking about many of the issues that you raised in your film. So I just want to give you a chance to say an opening word or two, and then we'll have a number of questions for you. So just so we can get the sense of hearing you. So why don't you just say a few words about yourself, and maybe the first question is, why did you engage and why did you want to make this documentary?
So my name is Gillian Mosely. You will know my family background from the film.
Okay, 1 second. Are you hearing over there? Yes. You can. Okay, I'm sorry. They are hearing you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I won't go into that in too much detail, but I felt that there was a huge amount of misinformation around about this subject that has been making things much harder to cut through. And I do genuinely believe it's very difficult to solve a problem if you don't understand what it is. So I felt that, this is my humble attempt to help people understand what the issues are.
And I definitely say, as one who's been engaged, and many of us in this try to understanding the conflict, you took an impossible task. And of course, in a documentary or a presentation like this, there's going to be many questions that people have about things that maybe were left out, things that weren't emphasized enough, things that they just want to ask your opinion regarding, where we go from here, or how the questions, affect each of us here in the States. I want to begin my own. It's the second time I've seen the film. There are two questions I have for you. One is, you use the word Palestinian over and over again. And of course, people who live in Palestine, let's call them Palestinians. But there is a differentiation, I believe, historically, about people who did not call themselves Palestinians until a certain later time in history, closer to after Israeli independence, calling them the PLO, Palestinian National Movement. My understanding is that there were people who lived in Palestine, Arabs, who identified as Arabs, pan-Arab. They didn't have a national identity per se. That's not to blame them for having a later nationalism, and I'm not taking away the idea that they have roots in the land. I just sometimes think it's a misnomer in some sense to call them Palestinians before they called themselves Palestinians. Your comment?
I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about this. I had a long chat with one of my aunt and uncle's best friends about this, because quoted in the film is Khalil al-Sakakini calling for independence as the British were marching in 1917. And this friend of my aunt and uncle's had not been aware of any Palestinian calls for independence at that point. The other thing, and I'm not an expert in this, but as I understand it, the whole concept of pan-Arabism isn't really fair either. That's a tricky one, not least because that also is part of the geopolitical rewriting of the map, that was down to, certainly Britain and, other League of Nations signatories. And again, I can't tell you chapter and verse of that. What I will say and should have said is that, I had parameters around the history I was trying to tell. And, as you probably noticed, the main history is between 1915 and 1948. And I only cast back and forward where I really, really, really felt it was necessary for context, where, whatever I was trying to say within the date parameters wasn't possible to say unless I expanded my time period.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then I'm going to ask you some questions that have been given to me. One of the things I had the hardest time accepting in your presentation is when you showed the maps side by side of 47 and 67 different, and showing the Palestinian population diminishing as Israeli control over different areas took over. And what I thought was left out, and again, I'm not blaming you because there's just so much to be said, but those boundaries and that population changed as a result of some serious wars against Israel. In 48, in 67, in 73, with the intifadas and so forth, with the Oslo Accords redefining territory. And I just thought it was a little bit deceiving to say that it looked like Israel was gobbling up all the land with Israel's population and not taking into account the various wars, some of which were foisted upon Israel, and Israel had to fight defensively.
I take your point, but if you look at the map of 1917 and the map of 1947, there were no wars to speak of in the territory, and there's still a huge territory incursion. So I think that's really important to remember. The other thing that I should say is that I have specialized for a long time in science and history films, but particularly in history films. We took an hour and a half's worth of history out of this film because we couldn't tell everything. So there will be a lot of things that are not in there. And in the end, it was a question of, a lot of the people we want to watch this film know nothing about this subject. They will remember very little. What are the most important things to tell them?
And the only rebuttal I would give to that is that for people who do know and have knowledge and are passionate, it skews it in some ways for those who want to look at it through a more Zionist lens than a more equal, balanced lens. When that piece of it is left out, showing the wars of attack, because you just said 15 to 47, but again, 67, 73, other times.
But I wasn't covering those years.
Fair enough. Okay.
I wasn't covering those years. And the reason I wasn't covering those years is because I believe that the patterns that were playing out in those later years were set up between 1915 and 1948. And so I actually didn't feel, I felt I needed to, explain a little bit about what was going on, but I didn't feel I needed to go into other stuff in great depth, and I wouldn't have had time. I mean, I would love it if someone would come to me and say, you can do a 6-hour Ken Burns on the formation of Israel, but nobody's offering me that money. So.
Gotcha. So I'm going to ask some questions that were handed to me. They're not all regarding the movie per se, but maybe just some of your opinions about the conflict as it's developed beyond your time frame of the movie, and just your understanding of the conflict of where it is today and things of that nature. Since you certainly are a student of history, and as it shows in this film. One question that comes up is regarding Gaza. That the chance after the withdrawal as a chance to show that, and it was a unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, as you know. Many Israelis and American Jews who support Israel say that was Gaza's chance to become, as it's even mentioned in the film, to become a place that, you know, could have been a oasis on the port, as a port city on the Mediterranean. And as soon as Hamas took over, and we know there was a war between Hamas and Fatah, and Hamas fought Fatah in taking over, it then became a place of building tunnels to attack Israel rather than a place for peaceful coexistence.
So again, you know, this is not covered in my film, so I have not researched it extensively. What I would say is certainly what I have seen there is a stranglehold around Gaza. It's as if there's a cordon around Gaza and very little gets in or out. And so it's very difficult to understand how they were meant to build such a, you know, an international port or whatever was envisaged. I don't think they really had the chance. The other thing to understand is that after the Nakba, the majority of Palestinian refugees were moved to Gaza. Gaza has, I think it's 2 million people in that tiny plot of land. That's a huge amount of people, especially, you know, if there are very few ways in or out, certainly on a regular basis. And again, we couldn't put it in the film, but you know, Kobe was talking about his grandmother, who was a seamstress, and they used to travel in and out of Gaza, you know, buying fabrics and whatever they were doing and seeing friends. And I think the interplay between the societies has changed hugely in his lifetime. He's a little bit younger than me. But as I said, you know, it was not within the scope of what I was looking into.
Right,
So,
but as you realize, I'm sure that all these things are interconnected and continue as a fabric, as you say. What started at one point continues on, and certainly Hamas does not recognize Israel's right to exist, is dedicated to armed resistance. And so if they took over Gaza, which they took over from Fatah, and created this enemy state on the borders of Israel, you can't blame Israel for having to stop you know, ammunitions from coming in.
It's a causal thing. If Palestinians were not made refugees and shunted into Gaza, would the problem exist? And I think, you know, as a historian, I'm very interested in why did B happen? Well, B happened because of A. And you know, so I always want to track back. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? And I just have to go back to the beginning. I had to go back to the beginning.
The problem with the Arab-Israeli conflict that's so infuriating, though, is who's A and who's B. And you know, and each one, like, again, there'll be some that will say A is God giving us the land, is promised to us. Israelis could say we have a historic right to this land because we have been, you know, there since 2,000 years ago, before we were exiled. And you did allude to the fact of 2 periods of sovereignty that Jews had in the land without being. So again, and then Palestinians can say, but we were here too, and we can go back to Esau and Isaac and Jacob and Esau and talk about.
Well, I think, you know, Canaan has a particularly vibrant history as a melting pot. And I certainly haven't, well, okay, I have met people who don't think Jews belong there, but, you know, that's obviously not what I think. But, you know, for millennia, there were, there were pagans. And then there were the Habiru Hill people, the Israelites, the Philistines, the Canaanites.
Right.
And DNA says that those people are all represented in modern day Palestinians and tends to be non-Ashkenazi Jews, but, you know, the more Eastern Jews. So in that sense, I think everybody belongs there. And
So I want to strengthen your point and then go to some more of these questions. One, first of all, the Torah itself in Genesis says, and the Canaanites were then in the land. So even the Torah recognizes that when the Israelites came into the land, there were people already there. So that's biblically. And then, of course, the phrase in the Zionist, a people without a land to a land without a people, was the way that the early Zionists understood themselves. Well, people without a land may have been true, but it wasn't a land without a people. And that was, Herzl.
And the Hadam says
Yeah.
says that.
Right, Herzl coming and looking at the land and say, oh, wait a second, there's people here. It wasn't just waiting for us for 2,000 years to come back. So that's part of that. Let me, one of the questions here is, did the Palestinians ever organize themselves into a unified government? Were they always tribal? And I guess we're talking about prior to, what they would call today, the Palestinian Authority. Before the Palestinian Authority, would they have seen themselves as tribal, or were they a unified Palestinian government?
I mean, that's a tricky thing, because as the film tried to show, even when Israelites were there and Jews and whatever, actually almost throughout its entire history, that land has been a colony of a bigger power of some sort, ranging from the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans to the later Muslim empires, laterally the Ottomans. So, there haven't really been, even when the Israelites were in power, there were Philistine city-states. It's been such a kind of patchy mishmash for the last 4,000 years. I don't think the locals had a chance to contemplate independent government. And as the film says, when the British marched in, there was one family that was controlling the civil administrations and another family that was controlling the religious administrations. And, we see today that the Palestinians have not managed to unite, although I have to say, from some of the younger people that I've met, there seems to be a sense that there are better ways to do things. Well, and Issa says it himself, young leadership, smart leadership.
So let me switch gears a little bit. The United Nations was mentioned in some ways, but many around the world, certainly Jews, don't feel that the UN has been a fair broker for Israel. So many anti-Semitic statements have come out of the UN. Jews are racist, Zionism is racism back in the 70s, and so many other, radical Arab nations especially have attacked Israel and used the UN for that purpose. Israel singled out more than any other country, perhaps, than for all the abuses that so many surround. Where's the attention to the Syrian massacre and so many others? And so the question is, how do you reconcile the United Nations being in any way a fair arbiter of the conflict?
So, I think, again, it's kind of, this one is difficult because also, as I understand it, and again, it's not quite within the parameters of the film, Israel was actually recognized as a state by the UN. So we're happy to take that recognition, but we're not happy to take other proclamations. That, to me, is problematic. Either you go with an organization or you don't. So I think that's sort of how I feel about that.
Well, I just want to push back a little bit and say, yes, the United Nations did recognize Israel's right to exist, but let's face it, it was on the heels of the world seeing 1/3 of Jewish people being decimated. And it was not a slam dunk. There were 13 countries that voted against Israel nationhood. And so I'm not sure if it was after the Holocaust that their sentiment would have went that way in any case. I'm just saying, I don't know if, I think the UN has at best a checkered record on trying to be a fair broken in that.
Yeah, but weren't the League of Nations and the UN both kind of never again organizations? You know what, that's their raison d'etre, never again. And I personally have to support that. Unfortunately, I see us in many ways loitering in not very pleasant territory. And I don't mean us Jews, I mean people on the planet at the moment. I think there are all sorts of potential challenges to that never again, which are difficult to look at. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is
Okay,
to that.
fair enough. A lot of these questions don't have answers, but as I said to someone recently, if we don't ask the right questions, we'll never get answers. So here's a question, again, outside necessarily the purview of the film, but your thoughts. What changes are you aware of that have been made in the Palestinian Charter since the Oslo Accords, if any? And the second question is, what infrastructure improvements have been made in Gaza since the Israeli withdrawal, if you're aware of any?
So I think, as I understand it, Hamas changed its position on Israel a few years ago, and I'd have to look it up. I have looked it up in the past, and they are not calling for the destruction of Israel. They are, they have a slightly more measured. And I have to say, I had this discussion with my executive producer, and he didn't believe me until I sent him a précis on the situation, but I'd have to look it up to find it for you. And I'd
like to say it because I haven't seen any change in the Hamas position for sure.
I'm pretty certain that there is. But again, as I said, this is probably not the best moment for me to go trawling through my notes to find it. And as I said, there has been essentially a cordon around Hamas since Israel withdrew. So very difficult to see how infrastructure could be improved, not least when, there have been a couple of big bombing episodes.
So another question I have that's been given to me is, what did they asked, and related to the film, why did you feel that, again, timing could be the reason, but why did you not describe the active collaboration of the Grand Mufti and the proposed 2000 peace plan between Arafat and Clinton that was rejected by Arafat? And so in other words, they were...
Okay, so the Grand Mufti during World War II.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is a tricky one that people may not like the answer to. I had that in the film. I have been showing the film while I was making the film. I had it in the film next to what Ben-Gurion said about using the Nazi position to further the aims of Israel. And I got absolutely shouted at by a professor here, a Jewish professor, who didn't want to hear what Ben-Gurion had said in this context. And so I felt, okay, you know what, this is not the conversation that I particularly want to have here. It's not the most important conversation to have, in my opinion. So I'm going to take them both out.
I see. Okay. I want to ask you a question regarding, there's a saying that says the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And certainly there have been chances, a few, not nearly enough, of potential solutions. I was in Israel in the late 90s, and it was like, or early 90s, I guess, and was thought that maybe peace was around the corner. That's when they opened up Jericho, and Israelis were flocking to Jericho, and there seemed to be this opportunity, and it quickly evaporated. And some would signal the lack of leadership on the Palestinian side, the corruption on the Palestinian side of Arafat, the fact that there's not been elections in the Palestinian Authority for 10 years or more, the fact that the aging leadership of the Palestinian Authority, it's mentioned in the film actually, that's been, so it's easy to look at the Israeli side and see to see the intransigence of the right-wing governments under Netanyahu with no will, and now under Naftali Bennett for no real will to make any changes substantially towards peace. But would you comment and say that equally so on the Palestinian side. There's been very little real leadership that would lead to a solution.
So, I'm not going to argue that the Palestinian Authority is an example of great governance, but what I will say is that Dror Maror, who made The Gatekeepers, has just made a film entirely on this subject called The Human Factor. And if you want to know more about what the exactly what the peace process was aiming for and who said what and who did what, I really recommend that film, and it's far more authoritative than anything I could say.
Great. All right. I'm just trying to see if there's any more here. I know that there are a few that I haven't gotten to. Let me see. Given the importance, well, no, here's a good question. Why did you feel the need for Jews, especially, to be aware of this, the origins, as you put it, of the conflict? And how does this contribute to the need to move forward in peace?
So it's not just the Jews. It's just that because I'm Jewish, I want to have this conversation with Jews, but I want everyone to understand this. This is an example writ large of colonialism, Western colonialism, and there are so many wars and violence persisting around the world to this day, not just in Israel and Palestine, that still have their roots in this colonization. And I think unless we understand that, we can't move forward. We have to be honest, hold our hands up and say, okay, this did not help. This is what happened here. But there is no doubt that people like Jabotinsky were riding in straight hot on the heels of the British colonialists, and really going in hard to bring about a certain vision of Zionism that didn't take into account the needs of the people who were actually on the ground. And that, for me, is, well, I say it in the film, I think it's hard to take because it doesn't give much moral high ground in the foundations. Whereas somebody like Ahad Ha'am is much easier for me to like, because he goes in, he takes a look, he sees the reality, and he comes away and he says to Zionists, you know what, there is a way to do this, but it's not a full throttle, everybody move there. We will never know what would have happened had we opted for Ahad Ha'am's cultural Zionism, because that's not what happened. But what did happen, unfortunately, had the effect, whether intended by people like Jabotinsky or unintended by other people, of displacing people. And that is something that it is really difficult to ignore and then maintain any higher moral authority.
So that's a great, I really want to take some of this together, and I'm going to ask you to bring it to the modern day, meaning like this week. Few things. This week was the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference. That group of very educated Germans came together to plan the final solution of the Jewish problem, which then resulted in 1/3 of all Jews being murdered. Jews did not have a place to flee. There are, even in the film mentioned, about 25 Arab countries, Muslim countries, where Jews, by the way, have very few, if any, rights whatsoever. And they were expelled, as you mentioned. So if there had been a Jewish state in 1939, 6 million more Jews would be alive. I, for one, well, let me just finish. I don't want to go back to a place where I, as a Jew, am powerless to defend myself. So the necessity of Herzl's vision of a Jewish state, not cultural Zionism, but a Zionism necessary for the survival of the people, which is what Herzl was all about. He was willing to even go to Uganda, right? So he was all about survival of the people. is necessary, and therefore a Jewish state is required if for no other reason. And you call it Holocaust paranoia. It's real. We see it.
I didn't call it Holocaust paranoia, but let's not forget that Theodor Herzl lived 50 years before the Holocaust, and I think that conflating the two is not helpful. You know, the whole point about my film is this all happened before World War II, and you know, a good deal of time before World War II. And I take on board, so you know, what's not mentioned in the film, because as I said, there was a limit to how far I could go, is that my family was booted out of Spain during the Inquisition.
Exactly, right.
So
right, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism.
I understand,
right.
You know, I absolutely understand all of that, but the reality is that there were a lot of Jews around the world who were very happy with where they were living, not least my forebears in Britain, who felt that Zionism would harm their positions within society in their new chosen home. And that was pretty prevalent, except you know, and this is really telling, except you know, for obvious reasons in places like Russia, but also with working class people. And when you look at the roots of Zionism, the Aliyah during the early part of the British Mandate, what's pretty obvious is that you get a bunch of rich people living in places like Britain and America paying for poor people from other places to move to Israel. And that is, it's odd. You know, you didn't see the Rothschilds moving to Israel en masse. The Rothschilds stayed here and in France. Why?
But that's your point, is that the vast majority of world Jewry have not moved to Israel, and the ones who have are the ones who are persecuted from Russia, from Ethiopia, from Arab lands. So the ones who have moved to Israel are generally those who are poor, who were fleeing persecution. I have family that has roots in Syria and in Libya, and they were forced out. And so
when were they forced out?
As a result of the establishment of the State of Israel.
Yeah, so there's a causality there as well that people don't like to talk about. The reality is that there were not those problems within Arab states and their Jewry until Israel became a reality, or started to become a reality. The earliest place where there started to be issues was in Egypt in the early 1940s. But there is a causality there. And this is something that Jews are not very good at hearing. If we do A, B will occur. Well, B occurred. Now what are we going to do about it? And to be perfectly honest with you, is the way the Israeli government conducts itself helpful to the world's Jews in terms of damping down anti-Semitism, or is it doing the opposite?
Well, first of all, Netanyahu doesn't speak for me, neither does the Israeli government, and yet it is a Jewish state, and we are implicitly affected by what a Jewish state does. I've made that argument too, so I agree with you, but I still take umbrage a little bit by saying, don't just look at what happened as a result of 48. You yourself said the expulsion of the Jews in Spain, and we can go over and over all kinds of anti-Semitism and expulsions that led Jews to—
I'm not saying it didn't happen. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that in this particular instance, there is a particular causality that's different, and is different to what most people think it is.
Fair enough. I want to go to the other extent. So on the one hand, personally, and I think many Jews in this country and around the world believe there has to be a Jewish state for the very purpose of what we see happening in our own country with regard to spikes in anti-Semitism and a lack of security, and wanting to know that we'll never be powerless again or have a home. Put that on one side. just hold that on one side. Again, we can argue different points of that, but put that on one side. The other side is this this occupation that becomes as a result of, like you say, A leads to B, B leads to C, and so forth and so on, leads to settler violence that has raised, whose ugly head was raised this last week in Bunin, in a village by Givat Ronen settlers who attacked rabbis for human rights and other activists who were protecting Palestinians in their while they were just trying to plant their fields, and we saw violence against them, and that was just the last of a number of price tag attacks, as they call them, to go out and kill and maim and intimidate Palestinians. And in the news that just came up today, and that goes to your idea of the film in some ways, there is now a film in Israel, Tantura, that you may have heard of, that's playing, just came out this last 2 weeks, that based on 135 interviews, is now claiming that Israeli troops perpetrated a mass murder in a place called Dur, which is near Haifa on the coast. And there's a claim that there's a mass grave underneath the parking lot at that now tourist site. My point being is that history is very complicated. We as Jews are not the first to want to cover over a past that we may not like. Every country in the world has a past that they are ashamed of. So I don't think we're any better or worse in any ways, but it's coming to grips with being enlightened about what facts might be. You used the term in the beginning of the film. We all have to agree at least on the facts before we can even have an argument. And when people make up misinformation or distort the facts purposely, we can't even have a conversation. I think that's part of the problem in our own country here in the United States recently. So just as a way of summing up, your thoughts on the one hand, as a Zionist, and I assume you're a Zionist, that you believe that there should be a home for the Jewish people, but it needs to be based on principles of equality and fairness and a just solution to the problem of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to understand where you may be coming from. On that one hand, that there must be a Jewish state for the reasons that I've anyway put out there, and what a continuing occupation and continuing denial of history of the conflict does to the Israeli soul and to, as you say, affecting Jews around the world when we don't attack the problem and see how it affects Israeli society as a result of not coming to grips with the reality of how it began.
So I'm afraid I'm not a Zionist. I'm not a Zionist. I'm completely agnostic on the subject. And I'm agnostic on the subject because I'm not sure this is how the world is going. There's two things that there's lots of things that concern me, but with reference to this, there are two things that I think are salient. One is globalization and the patterns that globalization are taking, and where things like technology are going to take us. And I don't know the answer to that. The other thing that I am deeply concerned about is, and you can put it in the human rights basket, is racism. But by that, I mean racism against anybody who is marginalized. And, I look particularly at America, but we're getting it here too. And I see a lot of let's just call it sort of white supremacist sentiment rearing its head again. We all know what that means. And so to me, it's important that anyone who might become a victim of that work together to ensure that that sort of thinking does not hold sway ever again. And so I'm kind of thinking that actually we should all be buddying down with people like the Palestinians, or, obviously Black Lives Matter is the most obvious thing, because, what I am scared of is white fascism rearing its head again. And I see a lot of examples of that, when I turn on the news, which I would really rather not be looking at right now.
Lana or Jacqueline, I'll ask you to finish up. Thank you very much from my perspective for taking some very tough questions. And thank you for being our guest and for bringing us this film. I'm going to let Alana, you take over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for working with us and
That's okay.
helping us with that. I have one last question. I know you've been in the process of bringing this to humanity, right? You've gotten into Jewish film festivals, things like this sort. I know you're trying to bring it to the general population through the actual cinemas and everything. So could you tell us a little bit about how far you are with that?
So we will, we're doing a crowdfunding campaign because we need to clear the rest of the archive, but we're like halfway through that. So we will go ahead now with our cinema run in England, which will start in March. I'm also, I'm going to do an event in Amsterdam in the middle of March at a cinema and cultural center with a Dutch Jewish comedian. So we can all have people laughing about this, probably not. We can try. That will be followed in the UK by a number of dates. I have already spoken to the JCC in Manhattan about showing the film there. Somebody suggested the JCC in San Francisco, but what we're going to do in America, we're not quite sure about. And then, the film has also started going out on television in certain places around the world.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for all your input and sharing all your thoughts, and have a good evening.
Well, thank you. And thank you for watching the film. And yeah.
Keep up. Yasha Kosa.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, bye-bye. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you. Probably nice meeting you in person.
You too.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We
Okay.
just want to thank everybody involved that helped, Bruce and Hetty Cohn, our co-chairs. We want to thank ARTSA and the Education Committee for co-sponsoring this. I want to thank the Rabbi. Is the Rabbi still here? Okay, thank you so much for your inspiration, your guidance, your participation. I want to thank the staff. Joe has been immensely helpful, and Jill and